Hey guys, welcome back to another video of Cloud Deep Dive. So in our previous videos, we talked about VPC endpoints or private link, and we also discussed about different type of VPC endpoint, and two of them were gateway endpoint and interface endpoint. I talked in detail about both of these endpoints, and I showed you the demo as well. During that discussion, we also discussed that S3 is one of the service which you can leverage both of these endpoints. Like gateway endpoint is available for S3 and DynamoDB, while interface endpoint is available for so many services including S3. So S3 is one of the service where you can use both of these endpoints. Now question comes that which endpoint you should use, whether you should use the gateway endpoint or you should use interface endpoint when designing your application. So in today's video, I will talk about these two endpoints and what are the difference and which endpoint you use for which use case. So we'll talk about pros and cons of using both these endpoints over one another, and in the end my goal is you should have pretty good understanding that if you have any exam questions as well, that which endpoint you should pick when you're designing your architecture regarding S3 endpoints. So let's get started. So about the gateway endpoint and interface endpoint. So the very first difference between these two is gateway endpoints are accessed by using the S3 public IP address, while interface endpoints are used by the private IP address which is provided from your VPC only. Now, what does that mean? When you create a gateway endpoint, if you remember correctly, and if not, then I would suggest you go ahead and first watch the video I recorded on the gateway endpoint, and I can provide the link in the description as well. So when you create the gateway endpoint, you create a route table. So basically you create a gateway and a entry is made in your route table which says that any transaction or any uh, query going to that prefix list, and that prefix list is basically the public IP address of your S3 endpoints or your S3 buckets or wherever the S3 service is, right? So any transaction or entry going matching with that CIDR in that prefix list will go to the gateway endpoint, and those are the public IP address. Even though your transaction or query will be going through the Amazon provided network, where the Amazon network is not going to the public route, but the IP address which it will be accessed by using the public IP address. But in case of interface endpoint, what do you do? A ENI is created in your VPC, and that ENI gets a private IP address from your VPC only. So when you connect by using the interface endpoint, remember we had a DNS name, we use the DNS name to connect to that service, and that DNS name internally get converted to the IP address of that ENI, and that is the private IP address of that ENI. So that's why I say that for the gateway endpoint, it uses the public IP address, and for interface endpoint, it uses the private IP address, which is provided from your VPC only. Now, the next difference is gateway endpoint does not allow access from on-prem, while interface endpoint provide access from the on-prem. Now, this is one of the use case or point where it will give you an idea that which endpoint you should pick and which you should not. So, suppose you have you want to access these endpoints privately from your on-prem, then gateway does not allow it, and I'll tell you in a moment why. And interface endpoint provide you that access. So it's a clear cut. Like if you have any use case where you want to access S3 buckets privately by using the private link from your on-prem, then you have to go with the interface endpoint. But for the other one, you have if that is not the requirement for the other use case, you can use the gateway endpoint, and we'll discuss the other use case as well. But for on-prem, straightway we have to go to the interface endpoint. Now, why you can access interface endpoint from your on-prem, not gateway endpoint? So, like I just mentioned, gateway endpoint work based on the route table, and that route table cannot be accessed from outside of your VPC. It can be accessed it because it's a .2 IP address, and that .2 IP address can be accessed from your VPC only. So that's why if you try to access that .2 address from outside from your VPC, it won't work and your transaction won't work. So you cannot access the gateway endpoint from outside your VPC from your on-prem. But interface endpoint, because it's an IP address that can be accessed, so you can use interface endpoint from your on-prem. The next point is, does not gateway endpoint does not allow access from another AWS region, but interface endpoint allow you the access from another VPC by using the VPC peering or transit gateway. So on the same term, because gateway endpoint can only be accessed from your VPC, only from where you have created. You cannot access that from anywhere else, from some other VPC or from on-prem. If you have any requirement where you need to access the private link from some other VPC, suppose you are using a hub and spoke model. Let me show you a diagram. So this is the hub and spoke model where I created a VPC. You have a use case that you want to control all the endpoints in one VPC and give that as a service to other VPCs, spoke VPC. So all the transactions from the other VPC will go through this endpoint, which is in hub. Then you have to use the interface endpoint. You cannot use the gateway endpoint because gateway endpoint is not accessible from outside the VPC. They can be accessed only from within the VPC. So this is one of the scenario where you will use interface endpoint instead of using your uh, gateway endpoint. Next is throughput limit. Gateway endpoint does not have any throughput limit. These are managed by AWS and they don't have any throughput limit. But interface endpoint have a throughput limit of 10 Gbps per ENI with a burst capability of 40 Gbps. So if you have a requirement where there's no kind of, you don't worry about the throughput, even though there's a cap on that, then you can use the interface endpoint. But if you want to, if you have a use case where you feel that the throughput can go more than the defined limits, then gateway endpoint is way to go. But there will be other restrictions which are applied to the gateway endpoint. Next one is the cost. Gateway endpoints are free. Interface endpoint will charge you money. So if you have a requirement that you don't want to pay and you want to access this from your within the VPC, then gateway endpoint is a straightway answer because that's cheap. You are not paying anything. There's no limit as well, and you are accessing from your VPC. But if you have any use case where you want to go outside of your VPC and want to access S3 privately, then interface endpoint is the only way to go, and there will be some charges involved to it. So one of the use case I want to show that pattern which generally uh, users use, that if you have a VPC, all the transactions which are going through the VPC, they use the gateway endpoint for that. But if you have any other VPC which want to connect to that S3 bucket privately or from your on-prem, only for those transactions, only for those queries, they use the interface endpoint. So you can have both the endpoints in the same VPC and use one for only for VPC transactions and other for the outside one. So that is one of the pattern you can use it. So that's all guys for this S3 interface and uh, gateway endpoint, and just wanted to talk about that which one you should use at when. Hope you like this video. Please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share with your friends. I will be coming up with more videos like this. Till then, thank you so much guys. Bye.